Hi, I'm Susan Eggers, and I teach history and geography with Excelsior classes. And the subject of our video today is the history of the relationship between Ukraine and Russia in maps. Although I studied Russian history when I was in graduate school, I don't pretend to be an expert on all of the complexities of this topic, but I think that looking at historical maps can help us appreciate the long and complicated history that has shaped this part of the world, and it might help us to understand some of what is going on today. Now, before we begin, I have a couple of points here. Number one, Ukrainians and Russians are both Slavic peoples in Eastern Europe. They have a very closely related history and culture, similar religion, and similar languages. In fact, for a time, Russia was known as Great Russia or Big Russia, while Ukraine was known as Little Russia. And there was also a White Russia, which is today Belarus, which means White Russia. The name Ukraine actually means at the edge, Ukrai, or on the borderlands or on the frontier. And sometimes you will hear this country referred to as the Ukraine because of that, because of the idea of it being on the borderland. Although today we generally just refer to it as Ukraine. All right, point number two, you might find this interesting that Ukraine has only been an independent country for a brief time in its history, really only since 1991. So that's something that I think has shaped this area and their thinking. And point number three, as I mentioned before, it's complicated. So let's dive in and look at Kievan Rus. Historians don't know all that much about the early history of this part of the world. In fact, the first written records that we have from Kievan Rus are from the 9th century. So that's the 800s AD. And that's when they created their first written alphabet. So on the maps, notice how far north this civilization extends. So there's Kiev right there, and much of European Russia was part of Kievan Rus. Okay, so first, the word Kievan, the Russian transliteration spelling of this is Kiev, while the Ukrainian is Kiev. And it's a two-syllable word, and the stress is on the first syllable. And the vowel sound is something that we do not have an exact match for in English, so it's a little bit hard to pronounce, but we're going to do the best that we can with that here. And then as far as the Rus, that's the people group, and we don't really know that much about them either. Most scholars believe that they are Varangian people, Viking people who came to this area through the rivers and settled in here and then blended with the people who were already living here. One important thing to note is that Kievan Rus was not a strong centralized state. It was a collection of principalities, and that made it somewhat vulnerable to invasion, which is what happened in 1240 when the Mongols invaded. Batu Khan, who was the grandson of Genghis Khan, invaded this area. In the year 1240, the city of Kiev was destroyed. Many of the people were killed. And this led to the rise of Moscow as the center of the civilization of the Rus. But notice that they are both part of this Khanate of the Golden Horde. Mongol rule lasted until 1480, when a grand prince in Moscow, Ivan III, overthrew the Mongols and created an independent state. But there was another power rising towards the west which is what I like to call the biggest medieval empire in Europe that you've probably never heard of. And that is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. By the mid-14th century, much of Ukraine had been occupied by Lithuania, and later all of this area in red that you see became known as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And here we begin to see a cultural divide between Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine. Western Ukraine was more closely connected to Poland and to Lithuania, while Eastern Ukraine was more closely connected with Russia. And we're going to see how that played out. Now, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth began to weaken in the 17th century. There were some internal problems. There were some Cossack rebellions, which helped to weaken control in that area. And by the late 17th century, much of Eastern Ukraine was under Russian control. And so you can see the city of Kyiv right here as part of the Russian Empire at this point. Then in the late 18th century, on 3 separate occasions, Prussia, Austria, and Russia divided or partitioned Poland until it no longer existed. Note that much of Ukraine came under Russian control. So that would be this lavender part and this pink part here. While the very far western part here in green actually became part of the Austrian Empire. And you see the city of Lviv right here, which you may have heard on the news, was actually part of the Austrian Empire at this point. Now, over time, the Ukrainian and Russian languages became more distinct. Part of that is because of the influence of Polish culture, especially in that western part of Ukraine. And some of it is just over time, how languages evolve and change. So when much of this area came under Russian control, the Tsarist government wanted to assert its authority. And because there was that historical connection, they wanted to bring everyone together. And so they discouraged the use of Ukrainian language and literature in an effort to Russify these new lands. Okay, so now we are going to jump to the 20th century and look at the Bolshevik Revolution and the Civil War. In the fall of 1917, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin led the Bolsheviks to a communist revolution in Russia. The people of Ukraine at this point thought this was a good opportunity to declare independence. So they called a parliament or a Rada together and they declared independence in January of 1918. However, the Bolsheviks refused to recognize the independence of Ukraine. And it was a very chaotic time. In fact, there was a civil war at this point because not everyone in Russia wanted to be part of a communist system. So you had the Communist Red Army fighting the anti-Bolshevik forces, the White Army is what it was called. And notice how strong those anti-Bolshevik forces were in what is today Ukraine. However, the Red Army did emerge victorious. The Bolsheviks won, and they began to create the Soviet Union. Okay, so when the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was created in 1922, Ukraine became one of the Soviet Socialist Republics. You can see it, there it is on the map. And if you look over here, you can see that this part was added to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Although not all of modern day Ukraine. If you notice this far western part, not until after World War II, and then the Crimean Peninsula, not until the mid-1950s. So on the slide, the point I wanted to make is that Ukraine did not fare very well under Soviet rule. And so if you want to look up some of the points that were mentioned here on the slide, one thing I do want to say is that in the mid 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev became the head of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and wanted to bring some reforms. He opened more political debate and discussion. He wanted to bring in some more free enterprise and kind of modernize the economy. And that, in fact, opened the doors for the fall of communism in Europe and the fall of the Soviet Union. So in 1990, the first, let me get back, the first Soviet Socialist Republic was Lithuania. The first one to declare independence was Lithuania, and that was in March of 1990. And by the end of 1991, all of these republics here had declared independence. So Ukraine declared its independence on August 24th, 1991. They organized an election. A vote was held December 1st, 1991. And you can see here on the map the percentages of different regions in Ukraine and what how they voted. Note that the western part had a very, very high percentage of votes in favor of independence, while maybe not so much in the eastern part and in the Crimea. And maybe not surprisingly, this map shows where the Russian language dominates and where the Ukrainian language dominates. So I think that's very interesting. And thinking about what we have just talked about, the historical maps can help explain why this happened, and also could help explain to the Russian annexation of Crimea, which was in March of 2014. And that brings us to 2022 and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And while there are many factors that have led to this conflict, I think by looking at these historical maps, thinking about the complicated relationship of the history between Ukraine and Russia, I think we can at least appreciate the complexities of what is happening today and maybe shed some light on what's happening today. So thank you for watching. And if you guys have any questions, you can contact me through Excelsior classes.